This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. On today's podcast, we'll look ahead to Latin America's economic outlook for 2025. Which countries are best positioned for growth, and which are most at risk from political changes, including the return of Donald Trump.
So you can do a map of the Latin American countries, and you can see that, other than Mexico, some countries are exposed, particularly the ones that are on the left, that sends a lot of migrants, and that have a lot of Chinese investment.
It's an annual end-of-year tradition now, right up there with turkey, tamales, panetón, or bacalhau. For the final America's Quarterly Podcast of the year, we talk to a distinguished economist about what's likely to come in the year ahead. For 2025, the economic outlook for Latin America is pretty good, with an asterisk. Citi currently expects average growth in the region of 2.3% for 2025. That would be up from 1.9% expected in 2024, thanks to an expected economic recovery in Argentina, as well as better prospects in Andean nations, including Chile and Peru. But the asterisk I mentioned, well, as always, that's politics. And in 2025, many Latin American countries will be especially subject to the policies of the new occupant of the White House, Donald Trump. It's a very complex scenario, not just for Mexico. And we've got a great guest to walk us through it. Ernesto Revilla is the managing director and chief economist for Latin America at Citigroup. He also teaches global economy at New York University. Ernesto, welcome back to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Ernesto, in the broadest possible sense, what does the election of Donald Trump mean for the economies of Latin America? Who do you see who might benefit and who is most at risk?
Well, it's of course the biggest risk for the economic forecast for 2025, right? If you were to do the outlook for Latin America in 2025 and you only look at the economics, Latin America would look relatively okay. Growth would be resilient, inflation will continue coming down in most places, same for interest rates. But of course, there's the elephant in the room, and that's Trump. What does it mean for Latin America? And there has been a lot of discussion. I think it's well understood that the main problem will be Mexico. Mexico is the one that has the biggest bilateral trade surplus vis-a-vis the US. The US has a trade deficit with Mexico. The topics of migration, drug trafficking, Mexico is central to those. So that's in a category of its own. Now, the way we think about the impact of Trump for Latin America is first thinking what Trump means for the US economy and the global economy. And that means volatility, uncertainty. If he's able to do some of his policies that will be inflationary for the US, that means probably higher rates in the US. And that's always a headwind for Latin America. So that's a broad first order impact for the region. And then when we bring it down to the countries, you want to see which countries have a leftist or rightist government, because that will be important in the next administration. Which countries sends a lot of migrants or drugs to the US, and which countries have a lot of Chinese investment or presence. So you can do a map of the Latin American countries, and you can see that, other than Mexico, some countries are exposed, particularly the ones that are on the left, that sends a lot of migrants, and that have a lot of Chinese investment.
But let's color in that map a little bit that you just did. The countries that you seem to think it might be at risk, apart from Mexico, that would appear to include Colombia. That's a leftist government that is an exporter of migrants. It's also, of course, a source of cocaine that gets sent to the United States. Brazil, a leftist government, not a producer of drugs, not a significant exporter of people. And then I suppose, you could look at Honduras as another country governed by the left, major transit point for drugs, exporter of migrants as well. So in your calculus, those are countries that will be somewhat on Trump's radar in a negative way.
I think that's the least. Maybe I would add Peru. I was just there last week, and you can see that there's a lot of Chinese investment. I mean, everybody's talking about the port of Chancay, north of Lima, of course, but there are many other signs of strong Chinese presence. Of course, I'm leaving out the usual suspects, right? I mean, I'm not talking and will not talk about Venezuela or Cuba because that's not an economic issue; it's more political. But if I look, for example, at Peru and the fact that Mauricio Claver Carone suggested that maybe the US could put tariffs to everything that comes out of the Chancay port because it was done with Chinese investment and it's going to be operated by the Chinese, then you can see kind of the rhetoric that you're going to have around these issues.
Yeah, Claver Carone, of course, being Trump's former top aide during his first term on Latin America and someone who has been in the press talking about what to potentially expect from Trump 2.0. Let's get into Mexico, Ernesto. That's your home country. We both agree that's kind of the biggest focus here. Mexico's vulnerability to any disruption from the United States is in a category of its own. Mexico sends about 80% of its exports to the United States. We talked on our last episode of the podcast about some of the specific risks facing the country. How do you see it? Do you think that the investors and markets are currently underestimating the risks from Trump's return?
I think there's an enormous underestimation of the risks of what Trump 2.0 might mean to Mexico for many reasons. I mean, the market has not been paying a lot of attention on the institutional deterioration that Mexico has been having. The fiscal slippage that Mexico had in 2024, which is huge, it's a 6% of GDP deficit. I think the market still thinks that it's a one-off and they are believing that the government is going to sharply reduce the deficit going forward. And we have our doubts that it's going to be as easy as planned. And I think this has been the case because Mexico, of course, has been yielding a very high return. I mean, remember, Mexico is an investment grade country where fundamentals are still strong, and yet the interest rate is very, very high. It's the highest around the world once you control for investment grade countries. So the market is not in the mood to hear a lot of bad stories about Mexico. If you couple that with the fact that this is not our first rodeo, and that we already had Trump in the presidency from 2016 to 2020, and the rhetoric was worse than what actually happened in practice. You know, in Mexico and some Latin Americans, they say a dog that barks doesn't bite. And I think that's the mood right now in Mexico, where they say, well, we went through this before. We know how to deal with it. We know that it's a lot of posturing. The USMCA is too important for the US. Trump is not going to shoot himself on the foot. Therefore, we should be fine. That's what I find a lot when I talk about with Mexican investors.
This view that Trump is just negotiating, that he's bluffing. And, you know, as you noted, there were episodes where that happened during Trump's first term. You could even look now at the recent back and forth where Trump made a very explicit 25% tariff threat. Claudia Sheinbaum responded. They had a conversation. There was, lo and behold, a very large and dramatic seizure of fentanyl on Mexican territory shortly after that happened. And a lot of people in our world look at that whole exchange. They say, oh, well, look, this is the game being played once again. Don't worry. It's not really going to result in any damage. They're both going to get to a point where both sides are happy and something like the status quo will continue. You have a different view, though.
So that's the base scenario that it's there out there in the markets. That's the consensus, and that's what the market is pricing. My point is, who knows, of course, but there's a risk, and you have to price the risk. I think that it's still the base scenario that at the end of the day, Mexico helps the US more than when it hurts, particularly given that the first and foremost strategy of the US, the way I understand it, is to decouple from China. And that has been happening already for a number of years. That's a priority in many circles in the US around Trump. And Mexico helps. The US, I mean, we have to recognize that the US cannot manufacture everything on their own. I mean, because of the labor costs, because of just the capacity in the manufacturing sector, because of labor shortages shortages in some particular sectors. So Mexico helps. But having said that, I mean, it's true that we are in a different world where there's going to be less globalization in a sense, more regionalization. That the U.S. really wants to protect many sectors and industries. That Mexico has been having a lot of trouble in terms of dealing with organized crime, and that the Mexican public sector is constrained by their own fiscal lack of space and even capacity to operationalize some of these things. So I am concerned that this time might be different, and I don't think the level of asset prices right now reflect that level of risk.
Sometimes I feel, Ernesto, like we overcomplicate things. I listen to Trump and I hear somebody who, one, really wants to do tariffs, and two, fundamentally seems to see Mexico as a negative influence on the United States and wants to put more distance between the two countries.
That's right. That's right. So I worry about that. Some of the moderating influences around him are not going to be there this time, as we know, particularly important for Mexico. I mean, Jared Kushner was very important in the negotiations with Mexico last time around. Same for General Kelly. And as you mentioned, he has a stronger mandate. He won the popular vote on top of the electoral vote. He has majorities in Congress. He has the Supreme Court. So this time might be different. And the status quo since NAFTA is that there's no tariffs between Mexico and the US. And we have to understand that for a long period before that, I mean, higher tariffs were the order of the day. And there was trade across countries. I mean, it doesn't mean that trade is going to go to zero, but it's going to be less free, more constrained. The US is going to be paying much more attention on specific sectors. And the US cares about the bilateral trade deficits. First, of course, with China, then with Mexico, they want to protect some industries. So I fear that maybe the average tariff going forward is going to be higher.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about the current state of the Mexican economy outside of the Trump question? Some of the things that you're seeing with business confidence, with the fiscal concerns, which you mentioned. What are the areas of concern and what, if anything, do you find more encouraging?
So the way I see Mexico is that Mexico is facing two types of shocks. One is external, which is everything we've discussed before with the second Trump administration. But there's also an internal shock. And it's very clear. You can see it in the data. The institutional transformation that Mexico is having at the end of the AMLO administration and now with the Sheinbaum administration is hurting investor confidence and is already hurting investment. So the Mexican economy is slowing down. For 2025, this following data point is going to be important, I guess, for you, which is that Mexico will have 0.8% growth in 2025 in our view, which is the lowest in Latin America. And Mexico is an economy that has much more potential than that. So the headwinds are already there for growth. Inflation will continue coming down. Inflation is still higher than the target of the central bank. Remember that we're almost 5 years after the pandemic. So it has been a slow fight against inflation as opposed to other Latin American countries. And the level of the interest rate is still too high and should come down. But overall, we see some headwinds in terms of growth, inflation higher than target. And fiscal that you mentioned, Brian, is a concern of mine. The level of deficit is very high this year. The government is planning for a huge fiscal consolidation next year. But it's hard to see how it can happen in an economy that is slowing down. And that would be the biggest fiscal consolidation since the 90s, even in years where we had crisis and therefore fiscal reforms afterwards, and even in years where we increased taxes. And Mexico is not doing anything of that right now. So I think it's an investment grade that it's on a difficult trajectory. So I guess we are a little bit more concerned about Mexico in the short run.
Ernesto, let's turn our attention to a comparatively easy and predictable country, Argentina. 2024 was a good year for Javier Milei. It was a year of some progress in terms of certainly the fight against inflation, which is now below 3% on a monthly basis. At the same time, the real economy in Argentina remains difficult. Social problems, increased poverty, and so on. I mean, the damage for everyday Argentines it's been tough. The big question everybody has about 2025 is to what extent will the real economy bounce back and will we see a return to growth? What do you think?
Listen, I think Milei has had extraordinary success in his first year as president. He has really brought down inflation, which was his main goal. He has been extraordinarily successful in the size of the fiscal consolidation, just improving the balance by 5 percentage points of GDP. That's unheard of in most economies around the world. Now, the problem is that, in my view, Argentina needs to move to the second phase of stabilization, which now requires prioritizing economic recovery, because, as you mentioned, Argentina will contract significantly this year. And they need to fix the problem with the FX, which is a parallel FX system with capital controls that has now led to a very strong appreciation of the Argentinian peso, which is always a bad sign and has always been a precondition for the sharp devaluations that we saw in the past. So how do they move from the first stage of stabilization to the second? That is like deactivating a bomb. They have so far pulled all the correct color cables. They need to do some of them again. It's not easy. The situation is still fragile. But I would say that the odds of success have increased, particularly with Trump in the presidency, because of what we mentioned earlier. Milei on the right is well liked by Trump. The possibility of getting an IMF renegotiation and fresh funds has increased. So that helps. And in the view of the market, nothing will happen before the midterm elections in October. So that's an important catalyst because Milei would want to get there with the highest popularity. He's around 50%, 55% of approval right now. So I think the base scenario for Argentina is the status quo holds up until the midterm election, and then hopefully successful elimination of capital controls.
A follow-up question, though, and this harkens back to discussions we've had on previous episodes of the podcast. Where do you think the economic recovery comes from? Because it's one thing to do your work on the fiscal front to bring down inflation and so on. But of course, a lot of that is by definition contractionary. If we're going to see a return to growth in 2025, what drives it?
Well, in Argentina, it's a very interesting economy once I see the correlations and how the economy responds to inflation. In Argentina, these inflations are expansionary for activity through the effect of an increase in real wages. So the sharp contraction in inflation means that real wages in the Argentinian economy right now are growing at around 6%. Consumption will be an important driver of the recovery. And then on top of that, you have animal spirits moving again in investment. There is a lot of optimism, maybe excess optimism on some camps around Argentina, but the microeconomic reforms, the fact that vaca muerta in terms of energy production expectations is really happening this time. All of those are factors that are behind the recovery that we see for Argentina, growing at 4% probably 5% probably in 2025.
We'll be back after a short break. The great journalist Alex Quadros has a new book out. It's called When We Sold God's Eye: Diamonds, Murder, and a Clash of Worlds in the Amazon. The book tells the story of the Cinta Larga, a tribe that had no contact with the outside world until the 1960s and came to run an illegal diamond mine in the Amazon. We'll be hosting Alex here at the Americas Society in New York City on January 15th to discuss the book. The event will be free of charge and followed by a reception. You can register on our website. That's americasquarterly.org. We hope to see you there. Ernesto, let's shift to Brazil. This one is actually a bit more stable, at least on the surface. The economy probably grew more than 3%, maybe even closer to 3.5 in 2024. But especially over the last month or so, the concerns about the fiscal situation there have really accentuated. The package of spending cuts and tax changes announced by the Lula government really disappointed the market. What do you see?
I think it's very interesting, Brian, how you phrase the question on Brazil, very stable with good growth in 2024, which was also the case in 2023. Remember, we were surprised by Brazilian growth in 23 and 24 at slightly higher than 3% in both years. Now, however, from the point of view of the market, Brazil is very unstable right now for the following reasons. Most of the countries in the world are reducing interest rates, and that's the case in Europe, that's the case in the US, of course, and the majority of Latin American economies. But the Brazilian central bank has been forced to hike interest rates because the Brazilian economy seems overheated. The growth is very strong. That's very good news, of course, in terms of the labor market, lowest unemployment since it has been measured. So all of those variables look good. But inflation is not converging to the target of the central bank. The central bank feels the need to be hiking rates. And very worrying is that despite this increase in rates, the Brazilian real has been underperforming dramatically, crossing the threshold of 6 real per dollar. Why? You mentioned it, Brian. It's fiscal risk. The market is not convinced that Brazil can put the fiscal house in order. Debt continues increasing. And this is very concerning for a lot of market participants.
I guess it paints the picture that at least some of this healthy growth that we've seen over the last 2 calendar years has been fiscally driven and therefore risky. Do you see it that way?
Part of it, I agree very much, of course. I mean, the fact that Brazil is growing very strongly and yet it still has big fiscal deficits means that there's a bigger structural problem with the fiscal situation, because when you grow a lot, you should expect to reduce your deficit because you have high revenues. So that's part of it. But also, let me say that consumption by itself is driving a lot of this surprise growth post-pandemic. The Brazilian consumer continues to be very resilient. So it's a combination of factors, but definitely loose fiscal, monetary policy, even if it has been tight and restrictive, maybe it's not as restrictive as people think. And therefore, Brazil is in a very uncomfortable position of having to hike rates, which actually complicates the fiscal situation because interest payments are increasing down the road. So as I say, Brazil probably will get worse before it gets better.
It's worth noting, though, that for 4 years in a row, Brazil's economy has outperformed the original market expectations. Some economists have speculated that might be due in part to actually reforms that were made in previous years, like the pension reform, tax reform, and so on, giving strength and, I suppose, animal spirits as well that allowed the economy to stay resilient. Do you see any truth to that? And is it worth thinking about even as we go into 2025, this idea that maybe we're underestimating Brazil again?
I think so. And there has been a lot of discussion locally on whether the potential growth rate of Brazil is higher now because of those reforms. It's also the case that commodity prices have been very supportive for Latin America and for Brazil, despite the slowdown in China. And that has been very good news for the region. And why has that happened? Because there's a lot of demand for commodities that is now coming from places different than China. So it's a combination of good luck and probably previous reforms. But the fact is that Brazil is the one that has been surprising the most in terms of growth in Latam.
One more Brazil question. I mean, these fiscal concerns, I've been following Brazil for 20 years. I know that you have as well. It can feel like Groundhog Day sometimes. It comes back to the fact that the Workers' Party and Lula specifically had many, many good years economically speaking, but under their watch, fiscal mismanagement led the country into its deepest recession on record back in 2014 and 2015. And that is really the reason the market pays such close attention. What signals are you going to be looking for from Lula and his economic team, including the finance minister, Fernando Haddad, to try to monitor whether they've got this thing more or less under control or whether there's risk of something even worse happening?
So the signals that they have been giving are the correct ones. I mean, even Lula and Haddad have been giving the message of fiscal responsibility. They have been trying to announce a series of measures to placate the market and to ensure that they are going to meet the fiscal targets, particularly in terms of a balanced primary deficit. But the fact is that they have not been successful yet in convincing the market that they are going to reach better primary balances going forward, which is a precondition required to stabilize debt. So I guess the market understands that debt will continue increasing, but they expect something more concrete and something not to be diluted in Congress, as right now the noise is that some of that will happen. I think that market understands that with Lula in power, the fiscal situation will not stabilize, but they hope for some window of opportunity where they say, well, you know what, this is enough for now. We can survive a few years with these high deficits, and then let's hope for reform down the road.
We've discussed the big three economies, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. Ernesto, I want to broaden the aperture a little bit and ask you, what other countries in the region have your attention? Who is outperforming? Who is underperforming? What are you watching?
Well, what we're seeing is that the Andean countries, after a very bad 2023 with very low growth, they are having very strong recoveries. And this is true for Chile, Colombia, and Peru. The story of the slow growth in 2023 was one of reduced investor sentiment, a lot of that associated with politics and with their leftist presidents in all cases. But that has returned. They are growing well. They will grow very good into 2025. More interestingly, perhaps, is that, as we discussed throughout this call, is that the biggest economies in Latin America have a lot of fiscal challenges. And we discussed Mexico, Brazil, and well, Argentina comes from a big fiscal deterioration now that it is being fixed. But the smaller countries are improving their credit ratings. And I'm talking about Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, even Guatemala. All of them have the possibility of becoming investment grade down the road.
Just to provoke you a little bit on a philosophical level, why is it that the smaller countries are, at least some of them, are having an easier time?
No, it's a great question, and I don't think there's a simple answer. I mean, one approximation is, of course, they suffered in the past. They saw their debt rises. They learned their lessons. They have good governments, and good governments, you can summarize it the way that President Abinader does in Dominican Republic. He says it's not that difficult. I mean, it's fiscal responsibility, but take care of the social programs. Be investor friendly, taking care of social programs, and then he's popular and he's doing fiscal reforms, same as some of the other countries. Maybe they have the margin of maneuver, maybe they are not as politicized or polarized as the other ones right now.
At the opening, we talked about the influence of the United States and Donald Trump. Are there any other global factors that are worth watching when it comes to Latin American economies and their outlook for 2025? What do you expect from China? Obviously, that's a big question. Are there any other factors that should have our attention?
So when we try to estimate emerging markets and Latin America in particular, it's always very important to look at the US, China, and commodity prices. I think we discussed the US, that has a high level of uncertainty. China is definitely slowing down. Our economies that follow China have growth of around 4.2% in 2025, way lower than the 5% in these last few years, and that the average 10% that China had for decades. So China is going to be a headwind for growth for those countries that are trade partners with China. Commodity prices very supportive. They look stable into 2025. As I said before, that's very good news for Latin America. But another of the big factors is the huge level of geopolitical uncertainty that it's out there, everywhere, with Russia and Ukraine, the Middle East, the tensions with China. And that has always the potential to increase risk aversion in financial markets. And Latin America suffers when risk aversion increases because it's a risky asset class for global investors.
One other factor, Ernesto, that might belong in that same category of external risks is climate change. 2024 was a year where we saw tremendous disruption, droughts all over the region that resulted in electricity shortages in the case of Ecuador, disrupted commercial shipping in the case of the Panama Canal. We saw a mid-sized regional capital in Brazil, Porto Alegre, that was ravaged by flooding in April of 2024. And is that on your radar when you think about potential risks for 2025?
That's exactly right. Climate is not a risk anymore. It's a fact that these countries and the whole world has to deal with now. It has impact on economic indicators, on inflation, on activity, on fiscal cost. You mentioned some of these events that Latin America had. There are others. And the fact is that it's a huge factor that goes into the forecast. The difficulty is that we don't know how to forecast these things. So we are going into an era of more uncertainty. And I guess that the margins of our forecast need to be wider because these things are happening more and more. And unfortunately, preparation and fiscal investment by these countries is limited by their fiscal space. So this is going to be, I guess, more at the forefront of policymakers and investors' minds going forward.
I've heard it said by some that Latin America may be more vulnerable on climate risks than other regions. Do you get that sense, or do you kind of look at the world and think maybe we're all equally vulnerable in a way?
That has been said. There have been some reasons for that. One is maybe geography, of course. The other is the preparation level that these countries have in terms of infrastructure, in terms of flexibility and resilience of the grids and so on. But honestly, I think we are all in the same boat, of course, in these terms. As you know, I'm based in New York. We are seeing things here that we didn't saw before. I mean, there were droughts in New York and New Jersey, never before, right? So I think this is a risk everywhere. But emerging markets are particularly vulnerable, I would say, on their level of preparedness and fiscal margin of maneuver exposed. As you said, in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, huge disaster at a time where the Brazilian fiscal situation is already compromised. So the margins of maneuver are limited, and that's worrisome.
Let me ask you one more question, Ernesto. We've focused so much on the macroeconomy, on things like politics at the highest level and fiscal balances and so on. All these things are very important to us, to our audience, and so on. But I want to take things down to the grassroots level. There's, perhaps you'd agree, a disconnect between the Latin America that we've been discussing and the Latin America that we see in the headlines so often. We've described a situation that is broadly stable. You mentioned some of these smaller countries where the macroeconomic framework seems to be heading in the right direction. And yet you look at these countries and they, particularly with the question of outward migration, continue to be exporters of people, and people are having, in many cases, a tough time. What do you think 2025 will feel like for everyday people across the region? Will there be any substantial difference? Is there a chance that people will feel, your average people will feel in their pocket, this material improvement that you described in some of these places?
We hope so. I mean, of course, a lot of is contingent on a big risk coming from outside, what we discussed in terms of big disruption in terms of trade or something coming from Trump's policies. But in terms of the average Latin American going into 2025, they will feel less inflation. And that's always correlated to sentiment. The level of interest rates in the majority of places will come down, except in Brazil. That's also correlated to good sentiment on consumer and investment. Hopefully, for the average Latin American, they continue to see progress in terms of their median income, in terms of sentiment, in terms of advancing. And that's what we're hoping for.
Let's hope so. Ernesto, thank you so much for joining us again on the AQ Podcast.
Always a pleasure, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.